So before I begin, I do want to say a few words about this tragic shooting that took place this morning in Winder, Georgia. We're still gathering information about what happened, but we know that there were multiple fatalities and injuries. And, our hearts are with all the students, the teachers, and their families, of course. And we are grateful to the first responders and the law enforcement that were on the scene. But this is just a senseless tragedy on top of so many senseless tragedies. And it's just outrageous that every day in our country, in the United States of America, that parents have to send their children to school worried about whether or not their child will come home alive. It's senseless. It is. We've got to stop it. And we have to end this epidemic of gun violence in our country once and for all. It doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be this way. So we will continue, of course, to send our prayers and our thoughts to the families and all those who were affected, including, I'm going off script right now, but listen, at the last year, I started a college tour. And I traveled our country meeting with our young leaders, right? And so it was college-age young leaders. So I did trade schools, colleges, universities, community colleges. By the way, I love Gen Z. I just love Gen Z. Right? But I'll tell you, one of the things that I asked every time I went to the auditorium, and it would be filled with these young leaders, students, and I'd ask them, raise your hand if at any point between kindergarten and 12th grade you had to endure an active shooter drill. And for the young leaders who are here who are raising their hand, I'm telling you, every time the auditorium was packed and almost every hand went up. A lot of us, I'll speak about myself, we had, I grew up in California, earthquake drills, we had fire drills, but our kids are sitting in a classroom where they should be fulfilling their God-given potential, and some part of their big, beautiful brain is concerned about a shooter busting through the door of the classroom. It does not have to be this way. It does not have to be this way. And, this is one of the many issues that's at stake in this election. So New Hampshire, look, we have 62 days to go. 62 days to go.
Stand up.
All right, that is Kamala Harris yesterday in New Hampshire talking about the horrific shooting at a Georgia high school. And I just want to add that if yesterday's school shooting had a deep impact on you, and I know it did, many of you, I heard from you, and you're not alone. If you've cried and been enraged about it, then you're not alone. If you want to make an impact on gun violence, there's a lot that we can do, starting with electing Democrats. So I just say let this tragedy motivate you to do all that you can up and down the ballot to elect politicians who have been endorsed by anti-gun violence organizations like Moms Demand and Brady Buzz and March for Our Lives and all of the rest, because that is how we can make an impact on gun violence. And I know that a lot of us just send our kids back to school, and regardless of where your child goes to school, it affects them. It can affect you. And so take good care of yourself. Have compassion for yourself if you're short-tempered, if you are especially emotional during this shooting or any other. Be patient with yourself and those around you. And we're all here for each other. This is an amazing community as well, the stand-up community. And I hope to see you tonight at the Hangout, where we'll talk about this horrible shooting and everything around it and so much more. Joining me today, very excited to have, for the first time, a very, very, very smart woman. Her name is Melissa Deckman, and she is the author of a new book called The Politics of Gen Z, How the Youngest Voters Will Shape Our Democracy. She's also the CEO of the Public Religion Research Institute, where Robert P. Jones, who joined us yesterday, is from. Just so happened that they both have books out, and I'm very excited to talk to Melissa Deckman on today's show. I think you're going to love it. I learned so much from reading the book, preparing to talk to her, and she's real good at talking about all this really important information about the politics of young folks and why it matters to all of us. If you want to jump ahead to my interview with Melissa Deckman, it begins at 27 minutes. But right now it's time for your headlines and clips from yesterday. At this point, you probably know most of the details about this horrible shooting in Georgia where at least 4 people were killed, 9 others wounded. It's about an hour outside of Atlanta. I guess what I wanted to say about it is just mention the gun laws in Georgia. No state permit required to purchase, no firearm registration, no assault weapon law, no magazine capacity restrictions, no owner license required, no permit required for concealed carry, no permit required for open carry, no background check required for private sales. So that is what the parents and children and people of Georgia are getting, and obviously they deserve better and should be. All of those Republican leaders from the governor to the U.S. Congress and state legislature should be voted out simply on this alone. I mean, you've got 2 of the congressmen, Georgia congressmen, including Marjorie Taylor Greene, another guy named Mike Collins, making those stupid campaign ads in the past years for their campaigns, holding guns, shooting guns, talking about guns, defending guns, and arguing and bragging that they will never, ever do anything to put restriction on having access to these deadly weapons. So that's all I have to say about that in the headlines. Another big story from yesterday, the Department of Justice, Department of State, and Department of Treasury announced that a joint effort to target with sanctions and criminal charges what the Biden administration says are Russian government-sponsored attempts to manipulate the U.S. public opinion ahead of the November election. Huge story yesterday where the Biden administration announced a series of actions in response to alleged efforts by Russian actors to influence U.S. public opinion in this upcoming election. Attorney General Merrick Garland announced charges against 2 employees of the Russian-backed media network RT who were accused of conspiring to commit money laundering and violating the Foreign Agents Registration Act in an indictment unsealed Wednesday in the Southern District of New York. And that's a huge story, and I want to read all of it to you, but I got to move on to some of the other big stories from yesterday because I don't usually get stuck on one here. That's why it's called headlines, everybody. A federal judge yesterday denied the disgraced former president Donald Trump's second and last-ditch bid to transfer his New York hush money case to federal U.S. court. U.S. District Judge Alvin Hellerstein of the Southern District of New York found that there was no good cause to grant Trump's lawyers permission to even file a motion. Trump's attorneys filed a notice of appeal late Tuesday night. We'll follow where that goes. Have you heard about this public parks controversy in Florida where Ron DeSantis basically wanted to develop state parks, build golf courses and resorts on them? Well, the governor is now trying to distance himself from these controversial proposals to build golf courses and hotels in state parks, saying he didn't approve the proposals before they were leaked. The proposal for some state parks sparked outrage among residents, and the governor made it sound as if the half-baked plan was leaked before it was ready, but the department's attempted public rollout shows this was a proposal in its final stages. So that story gets more interesting if you're following that down in Florida. The Biden administration yesterday announced more permanent asylum limits, weighing policy changes that would make the president's temporary asylum restrictions almost impossible to lift. Changes would build on the executive order President Biden issued in June to block a vast majority of asylum claims on the southern border. So that's another really important story to talk about border security and immigration. A lot of pro-immigration activists not happy about this. The administration wants to require that border crossings remain low for several consecutive weeks, a change that would make it extraordinarily unlikely that restrictions would lift anytime soon. Well, the presidential election is 62 days away. What are you doing? What can we do? Thank you for everybody supporting me on my swing state tour. I'll be in Nevada next week doing all I can to learn about the candidates' issues there and turn out the vote, get out the vote. And now here's some other headlines. President Biden preparing to block a bid by Japan's Nippon Steel to buy U.S. steel on national security grounds, according to people familiar with the matter. Hunter Biden's trial on tax charges begins today in Los Angeles. There's no indications that a plea deal is likely. In Mexico, the lower house of Congress approved a contentious overhaul of the judiciary that would allow voters to elect nearly all of the country's judges. And in Canada, the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, might face an election earlier than expected after a left-leaning political party ended an agreement that propped up his party in Parliament. And meteorologists are saying that Phoenix has now had 100 straight days with triple-digit temperatures, and there is no end in sight for those of you in Arizona. All right, those are the headlines that I've got for you today. Now it's time to get to those sound bites, the clips I've gathered, and I hope it works today. I'm not too worried.
All right, let's start with a fun and good one. Justice happening. I like it. A federal judge in Atlanta yesterday issued a temporary injunction ordering Donald Trump and his campaign to stop using a song co-written by the late musician Isaac Hayes at their event. Isaac Hayes III, his son, said in a social media post last month that he was demanding $3 million in licensing fees from Trump and his campaign for authorized use of the song Hold On, I'm Coming. And, well, here's a clip of the lawyer and Isaac Hayes III from after the decision was announced outside of court. And for some reason, the clip I grabbed has some of Isaac Hayes' music, and that makes it a little more fun, I guess.
No one has ever stood up to Donald Trump like this. My co-counsels, Reginald Green, and Mr. Griggs, we've stood with this man, and he and his family stood up to Donald Trump today, and I'm very proud of him. Very proud of you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. We are very grateful and happy for the decision by Judge Thrash. Donald Trump has been barred from ever playing the music of Isaac Hayes again. I couldn't ask for a better decision. I want this to serve as an opportunity for other artists to come forward that don't want their music used by Donald Trump. And continue to fight for music, artist rights, and copyright. Any questions?
Your reaction to the judge saying that he would not ask that the videos be taken down?
That's temporary. Once we get to trial and we prove that they do not have a license, today was a preliminary injunction to stop them from using it any further.
All right, there you go. That's Isaac Hayes III and his lawyer yesterday. Now let's go over to MSNBC Morning Joe, where Mike Barnicle, I thought was great, just talking about the way media covers Trump versus Harris. And this 2 minutes is worth listening to.
Joe, that clip that we showed coming into this segment was 10 years ago. Donald Trump saying that John McCain, was not a war hero, or he was a war hero, but he was captured. He liked people who weren't captured. He has had a grip on the Republican Party ever since then. When that happened, I received a call early in the morning, on the night after he said that, from a fairly prominent Democratic United States senator who said, "Did you hear what Trump said last night about John McCain?" And we both agreed on the phone, and I think a lot of people probably shared the agreement, that his candidacy was done before it ever took off. But it wasn't done. He became president of the United States. So that's what the Republican Party is living with every day since then. And today, we have a damaged, delusional old man who, again, might get reelected to the presidency of the United States. He is that close to it again. How did this happen? How does it happen that a man who speaks the way he speaks, deranged sometimes, delusional sometimes, some of the things he posts on Truth Social, his website, you cannot repeat on American television. You wouldn't repeat the words in front of your children. That's who he is. How did we get here? How did the Republican Party get here? And I have to tell you, and I hesitate to say this, and I don't know whether Jonathan or Willie or Donnie would agree with me, but there's a false equivalency going on in the coverage of this race, in that Donald Trump can say whatever crazy things he wants to say about submarines and sharks and electric batteries, whatever he wants to say. And it's not really covered in the sense that it's covered describing who said it, why he said it, and who the man is, Trump, out of his mind. And always in that story, in the equivalency, the false equivalency by too many reporters and too many American newspapers, there's also, by the way, Kamala Harris changed her mind on fracking. They always throw in something like that in coverage of the story. It's ridiculous. We don't cover the man for how dangerous he is.
All right, there you go. I thought that was really great. And to add to it, here's Jeffrey Goldberg, who's the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic. He also hosts the show Washington Week, which I think airs on PBS. I have no idea why there's music in this clip, and I couldn't find it elsewhere. But Jeffrey Goldberg says something similar to his panel, which I thought was really important and wanted to share with you. Again, sorry about the weird music.
I'll call it plainly a double standard that we have in this campaign. We're sitting here parsing, as we should, what the Democratic nominee for president says in an interview, how she answers questions about a whole range of subjects. Meanwhile, this is what Donald Trump had to say this week.
Groceries, food has gone up at levels that nobody's ever seen before. We've never seen anything like it, 50, 60, 70%. You take a look at bacon and some of these products, and some people don't eat bacon anymore. And we are going to get the energy prices down. When we get energy down, this was caused by their horrible energy, wind. They want wind all over the place. But when it doesn't blow, we have a little problem.
Here's the thing. I'll make this observation. I'll own it. If Kamala Harris went from bacon to wind in her interview with Dana Bash, she would this morning not be, the next morning, she would not be the nominee of the Democratic Party. That would have been a very, very strange. People would have been like, what is going on? Do we just have an absurdly low standard now for the things that Donald Trump says and does?
Yeah, very well said by Jeff Goldberg and that weird music. All right, now let's head back over to MSNBC where Katty Kay had the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, on, and I thought this was great.
Governor, we know that there is polling suggesting that amongst women, at least, abortion rights have crept up even to the number one issue that they are concerned about. But overall, the polls are consistent. The number one issue for all people in America is still the economy, inflation, and the cost of goods. Do you think the Harris campaign is, as far as you can see in Michigan, is doing enough to address that issue and then the issue of immigration?
I appreciate the question, Katty, and I would submit that abortion is about the economy too, right? The most important, profound decision a person or family or woman will make is whether and when to bear a child. So this is about our personal economy. This is about our collective economy. How can women get in the workforce if they can't even make their own decisions about whether and when to bear a child or access the health care that they need? And so I would submit, when you look at Donald Trump, who wants to rip these rights away, and you look at Kamala Harris, who wants to give women greater access, when you look at Kamala Harris's platform to get more money in the pockets of Americans versus Donald Trump, who wants to just throw tariffs that'll get passed on to people and will cripple the American consumer, we know that this is a stark choice, whether it's on the economy as many people define it, or is about the personal economy. Kamala Harris is the one who's going to empower people and help more Americans keep money in their pocket versus what Donald Trump's going to do, whatever's in Donald Trump's best interest at the time, which is why you can't trust this guy.
All right, there you go, Gretchen Whitmer, Michigan. Here's Tim Walz yesterday at on the campaign trail. I'm not sure exactly where it was. Sorry about it. The audio is not perfect, but it gets better, and I thought it's real important. He's so good at this.
This is going to be door-to-door, phone call to phone call. It's going to be engaging people who it is a deliberate effort by some people to make them believe that our political system is broken, to make them believe that things are pessimistic. My God, every time I hear Donald Trump give a speech, it's like the next screenplay for Mad Max or something. They're rooting against America. They do not believe in the exceptionalism of this country. They do not believe in the people who built this country. They simply want to complain about them. And by you coming here and talking neighbor to neighbor, that's what inspires people. My wife always talks about this. She said, I don't read the paper to see the movie reviews. I ask people that I know what they think about it, and they tell me. That's the same thing that's going on here. And I think all of you in this room, it's not hyperbole to say, this election could very well hinge on this county here and this field office here and the folks that we get out. That is an awesome responsibility, but it's also an awesome opportunity.
All right, Tim Walz yesterday on the campaign trail. Well, the bad audio but important content continues with Liz Cheney, who was at Duke University's School of Public Policy yesterday, when she endorsed Kamala Harris. That's right, a Cheney endorsing a Democrat. Hell hath frozen over, but I think this is important.
Because we're here in North Carolina, I think it is crucially important for people to recognize not only is what I just said about the danger that Trump poses something that should prevent people from voting for him, but I don't believe that we have the luxury of writing in candidates' names, particularly in swing states. And as a conservative, as someone who believes in and cares about the Constitution, I have thought deeply about this. And because of the danger that Donald Trump poses, not only am I not voting for Donald Trump, but I will be voting for Kamala Harris.
Wow, they went crazy for her there at Duke yesterday. And let's move on. Let's go to Fox News, where the liberal on the panel, Jessica Tarlov, made a really good point. And it's always just worth hearing her or any smart liberal like Pete Buttigieg and others on Fox News. I feel like it's comforting knowing that the audience had to hear this.
Totally. We have rifle encounters of all political persuasions, but we also do have nonpartisan groups like the Penn Wharton group that put out their budget model and said that Donald Trump would take the deficit $5.8 trillion she'd only add $1.2 trillion. You had Goldman Sachs that came out today, and they said that the GDP will significantly decrease under Donald Trump and it'll continue to increase under Kamala Harris. Look at what Moody's has said, also nonpartisan, talking about how if you're going to round up a bunch of immigrants and you're going to have tariffs, which he keeps saying isn't a tax on consumers, and that's what the national tax is that people are talking about, if you're going to implement tariffs, guess what's going to happen? The economy is going to suffer for it. That's not what Kamala Harris is proposing, and the American public is
Okay. All right. Thank you. Good stuff. Yeah. Like it. Love it. And now let's head over to Mehdi Hassan over on his news outlet, Zeteo. Is that what it's called? He does a great job, and I cut it off a little early, but I give you about 3 minutes of him making the case, putting to bed this argument that somehow Donald Trump was not pro-war, didn't start any wars, didn't escalate any wars, and I just thought this was a great clip worth sharing.
I keep meeting people in left-wing circles, in Muslim circles, in Arab American circles, who tell me that they're voting for Donald Trump because he isn't a hawk. He didn't start any new wars. He killed fewer Muslims than Democratic presidents do. This argument is doing my head in because it just isn't true. It's total nonsense. So when it comes to Trump and war and killing Muslims in particular, it's time for a debunking. Number one, he didn't start any new wars, they say. Well, it's not like he didn't try. We just got lucky. In his first year in office, he picked a fight with nuclear-armed North Korea. He called Kim Jong-un Little Rocket Man, called him short and fat, and threatened him with fire and fury. Trump's own Homeland Security officials were so shit-scared that he'd start a major war with North Korea that they had multiple meetings to prepare for a nuclear attack, a North Korean nuclear strike on American soil. In his last year in office, Trump illegally assassinated Iran's top general, Qasem Soleimani, via a drone strike, and the only reason we didn't have a full-on war with Iran is because the Iranians chose to show restraint and not respond in kind. Had Iran, say, assassinated General Mark Milley, America's top general at that time, we would have been instantly in World War III, as a result of Trump's actions. Let's be clear about that. In fact, Milley says Trump wanted to attack Iran after he lost the 2020 election. Trump also reportedly wanted to attack Venezuela. And now for his second term, he's considering airstrikes on Mexican soil. How's that for a new war? Not far away in the Middle East, but on our own southern border. By the way, this very specific and annoying claim that he was the first president to start no new war, that's just not true. Former President and Nobel Peace Laureate Jimmy Carter would like a word. And look, this whole not starting new wars thing is a distraction from the fact that Trump expanded and escalated pretty much every war that he inherited from Barack Obama. Remember, Obama famously didn't bomb the Assad government in Syria, but Trump did in 2017 and again in 2018. Obama didn't drop the single biggest bomb on Afghanistan, the mother of all bombs, the Moab, but Trump did. In fact, the number of Afghan civilians killed by airstrikes on Trump's watch went up 330%. And as writer Ben Krause points out, quote, there were more civilian deaths from airstrikes in Somalia under Trump than under Bush and Obama combined. Trump also oversaw a 200% increase in airstrike deaths in Iraq and Syria. Number two, well, at least he wasn't a drone president, they say, like Obama was. Look, Obama was indeed a drone president who killed a lot of innocent people with drone strikes. But you know who was a bigger drone president? Donald Trump. Yeah, you just haven't heard about it because much of our media is a joke and because both Muslims and the left, for some reason, have given Trump a pass on this issue. Here are the facts that you need to know. Donald Trump did more drone strikes in his first 2 years in office than Barack Obama carried out over 8 years in office. In fact, Trump didn't just do more drone strikes, he loosened all restrictions on drone strikes, making it even easier to kill innocent civilians.
All right, for more, check out Mehdi Hassan over on his new media outlet. And finally for you, I've got, apropos of the horrific shooting and all of the gun violence, this old clip of Justice Warren Burger. I've talked about this, and Siegel has mentioned it, and others have as well. But this is from December of 1991, conservative, former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, talking about how the Second Amendment had been subject to one of the greatest pieces of fraud. Listen to what the conservative Chief Justice says about how the Second Amendment had been hijacked, rewritten, transformed by pro-gun activists in the NRA.
In the Bill of Rights now, there wouldn't be any such thing as the Second Amendment.
Which says?
That a well-regulated militia being necessary for the defense of the state, the people's rights to bear arms. This has been the subject of one of the greatest pieces of fraud, I repeat the word fraud, on the American public by special interest groups that I have ever seen in my lifetime. Now just look at those words. There are only 3 lines to that amendment. A well-regulated militia. If the militia, which was going to be the state army, was going to be well-regulated, why shouldn't 16 and 17 and 18 or any other age persons be regulated in the use of arms the way an automobile is
regulated? The way an automobile is regulated. There you go, Justice Warren Burger. There you have it. From the archives. Very important piece of audio. Share it with your Second Amendment redefining and loving friends. All right. Well, those are your headlines and clips. We'll talk more about it at tonight's Hangout. Hope to see you at tonight at 8 East. If you are a paid subscriber, invite a friend if you want. Maybe we can get them to join our community. Thank you to everybody who has signed up recently or upgraded their membership to pay more, which is a lot of you, and those that have sent a little extra to me for the Swing State Tour. Much, much appreciated. Super grateful. Let's get to my guest, shall we? She is the author of this new book, The Politics of Gen Z, How the Youngest Voters Will Shape Our Democracy. She's the CEO of the Public Religion Research Institute, political scientist who studies gender, religion, and American political behavior. She was previously professor of public affairs and chair of the Department of Political Science at Washington College. And her other books include Tea Party Women, Mama Grizzlies, Grassroots Leaders, and The Changing Face of the American Right. Very brilliant, awesome at talking, really cool woman who I enjoyed so much and look forward to talking again to, and I think you're going to love her. Follow her on Twitter, get the book. Melissa Deckman joins me now. Yes, here she is. I've just told you all about her. Melissa Deckman, thank you so much. Welcome to Stand Up for the first time. I am really excited to talk to you about your new book. Congrats.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be with you today.
The Politics of Gen Z. This book took a lot of work. You did a tremendous amount of research, interviews, focus groups. Why not just go by the anecdotes of young people as to what they think? Why do we need all this data?
I think the survey data, the focus groups, and the interviews with these Gen Z political entrepreneurs, these really inspiring young people, I think all those sources of data together really tell a more complete and nuanced story. And I've always in my career tried to do mixed methodology, is what we call it as social scientists, because I don't think you can get the true findings or true understanding of political movements or political issues by just looking at one source of data. And so for me, this took a lot of time, but I wanted to get the story of Gen Z right, because I think the story of Gen Z is really, in many ways, pretty inspiring and giving me hope for what the future of our democracy looks like.
I can't believe I didn't interview you for Tea Party Women, Mama Grizzlies, Grassroots Leaders, and the Changing Face of the American Right, because I covered the Tea Party movement for CNN and SiriusXM. I went to tea parties. I was fascinated.
Me too.
Yeah,
I went to a lot of tea parties, yeah.
Fascinated by it, especially by the women and few people of color that you would see at them. But I'm trying to make a connection between that work and that movement, if you will, because it really started in a very different way when President Obama was elected and the Tea Party movement. And then that obviously morphed into the Trump movement, the MAGA movement. I wonder if you can make any connections between your study of those women then and certainly the younger women that you're talking about in this book.
Yeah, I'm going to try to thread this needle. Let's see how I can do this. So I'll say this. I really have long been interested in how gender and religion influences people's political decisions. What struck me about the Tea Party is that I was really captivated by Sarah Palin, especially. In 2008, of course, she gets tapped to be John McCain's VP. But she really galvanized a certain segment of women, especially largely white religious women who were pro-gun, who are opposed to abortion rights. And they saw in Sarah Palin someone that really represented them. Of course, the irony is that many people on the political right, including those in the Tea Party, would vehemently reject that they ever engage in identity politics. But nonetheless, she was a very galvanizing force for a lot of women. And what really struck me about the Tea Party is it really developed in reaction, of course, to the financial downturn, to also the election of the first Black president, right? But with the Tea Party, I began to see women emerging as leaders in a very conservative movement. And so I was really interested in that kind of oxymoron of, okay, here are women starting Tea Parties, being the face of the movement, especially initially, but yet they're women in a very patriarchal kind of movement. So that's really what the gist of that book was. And again, I married doing interviews, going to Tea Party rallies, talking to women that formed their local groups who were conservative. But the survey data showed that the ideas espoused by the Tea Party were generally rejected by most American women, right? Most American women tend to be Democrats more than Republicans. Not all, certainly, but most do. And I guess the tie to this book in particular is that I'm going from one segment, I think, of the ideological spectrum of women who are in very conservative movements to looking at women in Gen Z who couldn't be any more different, right? I think what the book really shows in detail, what our work at PRRI shows pretty routinely, is that Gen Z women are different. They are very liberal. They're very progressive. They're what I would describe as fiercely feminist. And they have come of age in a time in our politics where they've realized sexism isn't a thing of the past. And it's really shaped their outlook on really wanting more equality in society, not just gender equality, but more equality for LGBTQ Americans, more equality for different racial and ethnic groups. It's really part of their overall outlook about politics. And it's really got them engaged in ways that we haven't seen historically.
I feel like there are events, you write about this in detail, there are events and personalities that created these attitudes, these change in attitudes, that this awareness, this fight against apathy. I've been trying to fight apathy my entire career by being interesting, by being entertaining in my work to make boring issues more interesting because they're super important. Things like trade and tax policy or something. But you talk about all of the actual events and personalities. For example, all these horrific, gruesome school shootings, the climate crisis, the reversal of women's rights. And then obviously in terms of personality, the election of Donald Trump, which cuts through in a way that no other politician has ever impacted people. Certainly in Obama, everybody knew about him and what he stood for, and it was happening. But Trump actually created such a different atmosphere and dynamic, and not to mention all of those different issues that I mentioned that you cover. Talk to me about how this generation is different in terms of how they're impacted because of all these things versus, frankly, many of us, Gen X.
Yeah, so I think with Generation Z, their political experience has been tumultuous, to say the least, right? It's one that's marked by deep polarization. I think with respect to Gen Z women, to turn to them for just a few more minutes, they, of course, came of age politically when Donald Trump was elected president. So in 2016, they're about 18 to 19. So they're just starting to, in terms of adults, they're just starting to think about politics. But really, it was the election of Donald Trump that really sent shockwaves to lots of people. But for Gen Z women in particular, they couldn't believe that someone who was so misogynistic, said terrible things about women, bragged about assaulting women on tape, that the nation would elect someone like that over, of course, arguably one of the most eminently qualified women to be president, right? But then, of course, you have the Me Too movement, right? And that further cemented this idea that gender equality was important. But it was also, as you pointed out, that young people had gotten, I think, their organizational skills also developed by participating in climate strikes and participating in March for Our Lives. These were all things that were enabling young people, especially young women, to be more politically involved. But it's also a cultural issue. So I think that to understand the politics of Gen Z, especially Gen Z women, you have to understand what's been going on for the last couple of decades. For example, there was a lot of emphasis in the past couple of decades on essentially building young women's self-esteem, right? Having them play sports, going into organized sports for the last couple of decades, encouraging young women and girls to go into STEM fields that were traditionally male, right? And also, I would say and add, lots of organizations like the Girl Scouts putting more emphasis on building young women's leadership skills and also trying to give them skill sets in terms of civic engagement. So behind the scenes, all of these things that have happened have had remarkable spillover effects for young women. We see young women going to college at higher rates than young men, but naturally it began to have, I think, a spillover effect into their engagement. So they don't seem to be at all like older women, maybe women in my generation, my parents' generation, to be less inclined to pursuing politics. In fact, they are more inclined to pursue politics because of all these things happening. And then finally, the other piece of this puzzle is social media. all of us use social media. We're on our phones too much, all of that sort of thing. But Generation Z is the first generation to both produce and consume its own news online, for better or for worse. But in terms of political organizing, it has allowed Gen Zers, especially Gen Z women, to reach out to like-minded individuals, right? Or to allow LGBTQ Gen Zers to find folks who are like them and to share stories and to share news and information. But it's not just the hashtag activism that we're seeing. It actually has spillover effects, right? Gen Z is teaching each other to go learn how to register to vote or to how to get a permit to do a rally in a local park. There are actual concrete skills that derive from that social media experience. So that's why I think and how Gen Z is very different politically compared to our generation.
Yeah, and the generation previous, because when I'm reading your book, I just started thinking about how you'd be at a barbecue, social event of any sort, more likely that politics would be the subject the men, who we always self-segregate still by gender, would be talking about. It's a man subject to be interested in talking about. That is obviously no longer the case for any generation, I would argue. Everybody kind of understands, but more likely, women are far more engaged. And what you're saying now is younger women are even more engaged than men are. So someday at the barbecue, it might be more likely that women, or today, are talking about political issues than men are. It's completely reversed to the trends have changed because of so much of what you said. And I think that makes such a difference in the outcomes of politics, because if women are interested and they're engaged and they're running for office, what does that mean for the country and for women and for their generation? I guess it means a lot. You try to answer that. So go ahead.
No, I think that's really important. We didn't even get into what I talk about in the book is the role model effect. So we know that
do that.
Yeah. Generations of political scientists have looked at data showing that when young women are exposed to and girls are exposed to women as candidates, they're typically much more likely to be interested in politics. And again, you're right that historically politics has been the province of men. We still have a gender imbalance when it comes to running for office. Women are still a lot less likely to run for office today than men. Although when they run, they typically do well. They tend to win at similar rates, right? But what was really galvanizing for a lot of the young women activists I talk with in the book is seeing someone like AOC run for office. So in 2018, you had a historic surge of women running for office, largely Democratic women, in response to the Trump surprise victory in 2016. But time and again, what I found when I talked to women is that seeing someone like AOC, who was young, who was a person of color, who was very at ease using social media in ways that political leaders should take a step from her playbook, like doing makeup tutorials and talking to women about policy, getting into the boring aspects of why trade policy might matter while she's putting on eyeliner. Right. It's pretty genius, but it really speaks to these young women in profound ways. And in the book, I even do an experiment for those who are really wonky and want to get into social science, but I do a survey experiment of Gen Z Americans and I expose them. Some groups get exposed to a candidate running for state legislature that's young and female or young and male, older female, older male, that sort of thing. And what was really remarkable is that young women who were exposed to the younger female candidates were more interested in politics. They expressed more interest. But it wasn't even just the young women. Whenever they were exposed to more diverse candidates, they were more inclined to be more interested in politics. So any other category but the old white guy, which is the prototypical politician still, did not seem to generate more enthusiasm among young women in terms of interest in politics. For young men, it didn't matter who they were exposed to. So I think that's a really telling tale of how important inclusivity is to young women in particular. They want an America, they want a government that looks like them, that looks more diverse.
Yeah, and the role model issue is just an interesting one just from the standpoint of once you see a woman in that job or a person of color, or somebody you can identify with if you're of that category, then you realize, oh, that's a thing we can do? I thought we weren't allowed, or I thought there wasn't opportunity, or I thought I don't want to be the first one, and so on. But there have been so many influential, effective women, as you talked about AOC. Seeing Hillary Clinton lose and Donald Trump win was just earth-shattering for so many of us, including my family. I told my daughters on election night when they went to bed that tomorrow they'd wake up and there'd be a woman president. And it wouldn't have been the worst thing in the world if the man elected wasn't the worst man for a lot of reasons, but certainly when it comes to women. He'd been accused by dozens of sexual assault, and obviously when it comes to policies that affect women, like women's reproductive rights, much less just his rhetoric and the way that he talks and carries himself. So what you're saying is, and you can illustrate this with some of the women that you talk to and the data, that when young people and women saw that this man, this horrible man who just weeks ago we heard say things on that audio tape, on the Access Hollywood tape, about bragging about assaulting women, this man could get 70 million people to vote for him. I covered the Women's March in D.C. the next day after the inauguration. You couldn't move. There were so many. Those marches took place in cities all over the country. The backlash to his election is a result of him being who he is. He wasn't just some man. He was the worst of men. How does that animate young women and the rest of us to see who we really are? I always hate when politicians say, that's not who we are. Sure it is. It is who we are, sadly.
Yeah, I can't really emphasize this point enough. In the young women that I was talking with, that really the total shock of Trump being elected, from their perspective, it was just unimaginable. Now, look, the reality is that lots of people support Donald Trump. And he has, I think, this level of support from his followers, from the MAGA base, that through thick and thin, whatever emerges. I think Donald Trump famously said, I could stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone and my followers would vote for me. And I think that's true. I think we've seen just about every test case scenario, from fomenting a mob before the election was certified on January 6th. We've seen essentially, I think, some very illiberal and democratic by Donald Trump.
But allowing his vice president to be, I'm trying to think of the worst thing that he did close to violence like that, where he'll be allowing Mike Pence to be hung. Sorry to interrupt you with an example, but
that could be a whole other podcast of Trump's behavior in office and whether or not it's off-putting to many people. But I think with respect to young women, there's also the policy aspect. There's the character of Trump. But he is, of course, and he's bragged about being the president that led to the overturn of Roe. And I think for young women, seeing a world where their rights are not secure and actually going back to a time when they have fewer rights than, say, their mother's generation and older women, I think that's been really sobering. And again, has further reinforced the need for them to be involved in politics. I think the thing about Gen Z is when they see an issue they care about, when they feel that their rights are being threatened, they're more than willing to get engaged.
You're the CEO of the nation's leading nonpartisan research institute, Public Religion Research Institute. And obviously religion plays a huge role in everything you're talking about, and including this book. But it would seem that religion plays an increasingly weaker, lesser role for all Americans' life. Talk to me about the role of religion. We'll stay with women, and then we obviously haven't talked about women of color, people of color, really, Gen Z yet, much less LGBT and other identities that young folks have. But just talk to me wherever you want to go with religion's role in young people's lives as it plays out here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So we recently just released at PRRI our American Census of American Religion. And we track religious demography. And the fastest growing group in American religion are people that are not affiliated with any religion. The religiously unaffiliated, or the nuns, is something we often use that term shorthand, the nuns. And of course, what we find, not surprisingly, is that younger people are a lot less likely to identify with religion. Gen Z is the least religious demographic out there. Millennials, too, are pretty close, though. But essentially, one of the ways this actually links to the politics of Gen Z is that we find among young people who have disaffiliated, we ask why people leave religion. And for younger people, it's really organized religion's treatment of LGBTQ Americans that has led many of them to leave church, right? And so there's a sense that religion treats the folks that we love, of who we are, very badly. And so they're not willing to stay in organized religion because of that. Of course, the reality is that many faith traditions, in fact, embrace queer people. They allow for gay ordination, same-sex marriage. So it's a lot more nuanced than that. But generally speaking, for many young people who maybe, even if they had a Methodist affiliation or maybe were culturally Jewish or something, they don't really attend religious services as much. And so their exposure to religion is often that religion is a conservative brand of Christianity, which is not the case in terms of the reality of religion. It's more diverse, more pluralistic. But again, it's the perception that organized religion is very much against the values that I support, whether it's supporting LGBTQ Americans or even allowing women to have a bigger role in organized religion. So lots of reasons there that have led young people to really leave. They're leaving with their feet, and they're willing to say they're not affiliated with any sort of religion in surveys, increasingly.
Someone who does the kind of polling and data and is the scientist that you are hates a binary, I'm sure, but I'm going to throw one at you and you can poke holes in it. But sure, there are all kinds of caveats about very religious people can also be very open-minded on sexual identity, reproductive rights, LGBT issues, and abortion. They can be, sure. But if you are against abortion, if you are against, say, gay marriage, it is highly likely that you fall into the category of someone who is also religious. And let me just say it a final way, and you can tell me if this is wrong. Very few women who are against abortion are not also Christians. I'll say Christians, Catholics, but definitely religious. Most people who are against abortion are against it for religious purposes. They often say they try to make scientific arguments and so on. But tell me if this binary is flawed, especially for Gen Z, people who are against abortion, and there are some, obviously, against gay rights and all things LGBT. They're usually almost always religious. Tell me I'm wrong?
I think that's probably a fair assessment, right? Because I do, in fact, in my book, interview Republican women who are Zoomers. And by and large, I think part of what keeps them Republican is that they oppose abortion and they're young women of deep faith, right? I think that, again, no generation is monolithic, but I think you're onto something. We find consistently in our data that people who tend to oppose abortion or tend to oppose same-sex marriage or rights for LGBT individuals really tend to be far more religious. And that's very true. And they're far more likely to identify as or to be categorized as endorsing Christian nationalism. That's something else we tended to track here at PRRI as well. So yes, I think religion certainly colors the viewpoints of Americans in terms of religion. So if you're more religious, you tend to be more likely to oppose abortion. That's pretty clear in the data.
The other issue, which is not always so clear what we're talking about, but whether it be J.D. Vance or the Kansas City Chiefs kicker talking to a group of graduates at a college, granted Christian college, but still women who had gone to college, not all women, but they were there. And they're talking about gender roles and talking about the women's role in the home and in society and so on. That's got to turn off young women, most young women, including a lot of religious women who are looking for a career or for work. Not all, but just those gender roles and the idea of them being brought back by in popular culture is shocking and fascinating, in my opinion, terrifying. But how does that play out? Just the gender role attitudes of policymakers, much less leading cultural figures.
Yeah, I think in many ways I argue that I don't think the current incarnation of the GOP can be doing more to alienate young women voters than they are now in lots of ways. And it's really interesting, though, if you think about it, you have Trump and what some people have called the barstool conservatism, right? This idea of women are too touchy and we can't say jokes about women and they say they're being harassed and we just want to eat at Hooters and live life at how women are supposed to be treated in this particular area. There's that kind of sexism. But with J.D. Vance, you have, I think, really a more, frankly, dismissive view of women, what women are capable of. So essentially, women's highest vocation should be mothers and mothers and homemakers, or that the whole childless cat lady thing. We can talk about that too. But really, it's a very dismissive view of what women are capable of. And so the current incarnation of the leadership of the party right now, I just are doing everything they can, I think, to be off-putting to a lot of women today. But really, gender roles is really important. I think understanding attitudes about gender is really key to understanding a lot of political behavior in this country. One question we have at PRRI that we ask all the time is, do you think society's become too soft and feminine? And knowing people's response to that has tremendous predictive power of how they're going to vote or what they're going to support.
I'm sorry, the question is, do you think society's become too soft and feminine?
Yes.
By the way, I just got to I have to take a moment for a live read. Folks, if you like soft and feminine, you'll love Stand Up with Pete Dominic. Now, I try to act strong and masculine, but if you get to know me, not the case. Wow, that's a fascinating. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead and talk about what that, I don't even know quite what that means to people when they hear it.
I think what you're seeing in this current election cycle, and who would have predicted this, I think with J.D. Vance being added to the ticket, and then we can talk about Tim Walz, which I think is really also interesting, this added dimension of how we are perceiving masculinity in our society. And because it's actually in direct response, I think, to young women gaining more success in our culture. Again, culturally, we've been, I think, promoting success for young women. This is, I think, really tremendous. Title IX, for example, is one of these incredible pieces of legislation that has paid dividends over time in terms of getting women equal access to sports or to higher ed, those sorts of things. But the flip side of that equation is that comparatively speaking, there is a lot of data showing that young men are struggling in society, right? They're less likely to go to college. They're have higher rates of suicide. They have higher rates of drug overdose. They're less likely to be employed than their parents were, their fathers or grandfathers were at their age. So there are ways that young men are struggling. And I don't think the political left has necessarily done a good job of reaching out to those folks. But the political right is trying.
I was one of them. I focused so much on women and girls and their issues my entire career in media and obviously as a dad. And I hate when people say, oh, you only care about girls' issues because you should care about them just because. And I'm like, yeah, but also because I have daughters. That's the truth. But the truth is you have two sons. And I've interviewed Richard Reeves, the author of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What to Do About It. And I think you're absolutely right about it's a very hard needle to thread and to talk about, but about where the left has been on the issue. And it's a really important discussion that a lot of folks are starting to have. But it's very true. And it's a problem. If we want to advocate for women and girls, we need to understand how men and boys are struggling and suffering at all ages.
No.
Sorry, I just had to mention that there. Yes, for sure.
No, and Richard Reeves does really important work, and I think he's helping to lead this important conversation. But getting back to the right, I think the right has seen that there is a lot of uncertainty with young men. Maybe some men are struggling. They don't really know their place in society and how to kind of navigate all these new different gender dimensions. And so their response is someone like Senator Josh Hawley writing a book called Manhood, right? And so there's a narrative that the left has waged a war on toxic masculinity and men are the problem. But rather than offer any sort of policies that might help men get ahead in some ways, it's really about beating up on women in the left. And of course, you just go to the manosphere, right? You go to those social media influencers like Andrew Tate and others. And the problem is all about women. Women have stepped out of their roles. They're not really doing what they're supposed to be doing. And men's problems really essentially is at the root of women. So I think in terms of looking again at soft and feminine, I think getting back to that measure, I'm going to go back to that loop here. We tend to find that Republicans tend to agree that America has become too soft and feminine, or society's become too soft and feminine, because again, we have these conversations about the gender, the being non-binary and transgenderism and LGBTQ rights. And that's uncomfortable for lots of older, more conservative folks. And so in their mind, I think that's what they mean by America becoming too soft and feminine. But of course, with Trump, you have this hyper masculinity that he's talking about. We saw it at the RNC convention, but these are things he's talked about really since day one. And I think for many on the Trump campaign, they're doubling down on this kind of talk because they think they can meet young men where they are on video games, on these platforms, and really saying women are the real problem. It's not you guys, but we need to get back to an America that is tougher and more masculine and virulent or something like that.
Yeah, good luck with that. I would love to get just your quick take on the Tim Walz brand of masculinity.
I've heard, I didn't come up with this expression, but I think it's a really interesting one. The right complains about how the left brands men as being toxic masculinity, and Tim Walz is a tonic masculinity. So this idea that here you have someone in Tim Walz who is a football coach, veteran, sharpshooter, he's a hunter, he can fix your car, all these sorts of things. But at the same time, he's a very supportive husband. He doesn't appear to be threatened by women's success. And the fact that he's taking on this role as the number two and cheerfully doing it and talking about how great it is, I think it presents a man who's not is comfortable in his own masculinity in ways that I think the far right just doesn't know how to handle. And they haven't been able to get a grip on it, I think, in some ways.
One of the hardest issues for men of a certain age and men of all ages, if you will, to deal with and that we talk about is talking about your feelings. There's all kinds of memes and jokes about talking about your feelings, and this generation talks more about their feelings and all of that. And I want to tie another issue that you write and know a lot about that I've been in the fight in the school board, which is there's this very deep concern about what gets taught in our schools, specifically when it comes to race. And we can get to that now. It's all intersecting, obviously. But you'll hear a lot of people on the right say, I don't want my kids, my white kids they're talking about, to feel bad when they learn about what white people have done. And I'm always saying to myself, aren't these the people that say never talk about their feelings? And you don't want your kids to learn a thing? And what I've said that did not make anybody happier and certainly didn't bring anybody together at the board meeting is if your kids feel bad when they learn history about their whiteness, you're a shitty parent. talk to your kids about it and talk about their feelings. They don't need to feel bad and guilty, and they can feel really good if they create more opportunities and do the right thing now and so on. But tying that all together, the fight in schools to not teach things, the feelings issue, and obviously when it comes to white people having their feelings hurt, white people being the victims, what about our feelings, Melissa?
I don't want to talk about your feelings, but I will say this.
Yes, just me now. The rest of it is direct therapy.
Yeah. So my earliest book was about the Christian rights attempt to take over school boards across the country, and which was actually more nuanced than that again. But one of the things I found then is that when conservative Christians were elected to school boards and had an agenda that was overtly religious, one school district where conservative Christians ran, and this is in the 1990s, this is the heyday of the Christian Coalition and Pat Robertson and Ralph Reed and all that. They often overreached, right? So one school board decided we can't offer free school lunches anymore because that's a usurpation of the role of the family, right? This is communist socialism, all of that sort of thing. And most people in the community were like, that's not good. And they got booted out in the next election cycle, right? So there's a tendency to overreach here. But I think when it comes to schools and education, it's really about cultural change. Who gets to define our history? Who gets to define who is really an American? Who gets to define the American story? And I think the good news is even in our own data, we find at PRRI that the vast majority of Americans say, look, we should teach the good and bad of American history. So this is something that most Americans would agree with. The devil's always in the details. But the reality is we have a country that is becoming far more racially and ethnically diverse. And Gen Z, I should point out, about 1 in 2 are non-white. Gen Zers are non-white, right? So that's profoundly influential in coloring their views and their priorities. But in schools, it's about, and really, I think this attempt is really trying to turn back the clock in some ways, right? In terms of older white Americans who are seeing a country that is less religious, that's more racially and ethnically diverse, that is more queer, that is really going beyond these kinds of ideas of a strict gender binary or the ideas of what women's and men's roles should be, right? And so those things are very uncomfortable to them. And I think that's the through line here, is that they recognize that through schools and through curriculum, we can maybe try to change what kids are learning. But here's the thing. In the 21st century, when most kids are on their devices nonstop, they're learning from each other, right? I think it's a red herring when they talk about the universities and colleges having this liberal indoctrination happening in schools. And I was a college professor for 20 years, and I can tell you that they weren't listening to me necessarily. They weren't even doing the reading for class, whether it's controversial or not, but they are learning from each other. They're learning from each other.
It's preposterous. The best example of that, as gross as it is, I just interviewed Amanda Jones, who's a librarian, wrote this amazing book. We had the same exact accusation levied against us, and we've heard it around the country, but saying to me at board meetings on Facebook, you want to teach 8th graders about anal sex. And they're referring to the fact that sex ed is taught in 8th grade. I'm like, first of all, what year is it that we're talking about whether or not sex ed should be taught? But second of all, when they say you want to teach 8th graders about anal sex, I'm like, to your point, every 8th grade boy knows about anal sex. It's the majority of their jokes. And it was before the internet when I was in 8th grade in the late 80s. Like the idea that we're teaching them about anything other than how to be responsible, the dangers of anything around sex, versus that they're for the first time learning about it from us, is the greatest red herring. And it's real disgusting to think that you're teaching it, much less. But the idea is to illustrate your point. They already know. They talk to each other on the bus in the old days and now on their phones all day long.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And of course, the social scientist in me wants to point to data, but I was really deep into this in the 90s when I was doing research for the first book. But it's very clear that sex education actually delays first sexual experiences because the kids are curious, and I'd rather them get good information about how to be healthy and all of those sorts of things. And we find too at PRRI, we did a big survey last year. Most Americans think that we should have sex education, have comprehensive sex education, not abstinence only sorts of things. But the kids they're learning from each other, right? They're
of course they are. Yes. Yeah, like you can't – it's just crazy that you think you can control everything that your kids are watching. I'll never forget being shocked when my then 12-year-old was watching the show Shameless. I had no idea what it even was, but it is graphic sexually, and I was just astonished, and I am no prude. I'm open-minded about all of it, sex positive, everything, and I was shocked. But the point is trying to control what they're learning and where they're learning it. Once they get that phone, have an internet connection, they don't even need any friends.
But it's also I think it's also their lived experience, just real quick to add to this too. So a lot of what you're seeing in red states is one, trying to Oklahoma. Now we're going to have the Bible be taught, but that's a whole other conversation. But on sex education in particular, or we can't have themes about gays and lesbians in schools. But the big brouhaha in the 1990s, there was a book called Heather Has Two Mommies. And the conservative Christian organizations were up in arms that we're going to expose our kids to these alternative and families, right? And the reality is that the lived experience of Gen Z, 1 in 4 Zoomers are queer. Many of them know same-sex couples. They have parents who are same-sex. So it's like the reality of people's lives is not getting reflected in the schools. And so to think somehow just banning a conversation about it is going to change that is really, or posting the 10 Commandments in a classroom is suddenly going to change people's lived experiences is not going to happen.
Really important point. Just from the standpoint of when I guess I was in my 20s, Will and Grace, Ellen DeGeneres, and other pop culture figures just normalizing homosexuality in that case. And so then, if you know somebody at this point who's got 2 moms or 2 dads, it's hard to obfuscate that. And that's why they homeschool. Race. We haven't talked about it. You talk to a lot of young black folks, and you talk a lot about young black women, particularly being the leaders of many of these political movements. Tell me anything you want about how that intersection of young black women, especially.
Yeah, and so there's a term called intersectionality that you may have heard of before, but this is like the idea that for young, really just for any black woman, right? They have grown up in a world where not only that they're women, but they're racial minorities. You can say the same thing about Latinas or any kind of group, or LGBTQ Zoomers who are of color. So the idea is that with these multiple identities, I think their perceptions of the world are different, but they're also heightened about how unique pressures face them. Again, we see it writ large in talking about Kamala Harris, right? Being both black female and what that might mean for her candidacy. But in many ways, though, that intersectional lens, I think, has fueled their reason they want to get involved in politics, because they see that injustices against African Americans or against women or against LGBTQ individuals or Latinos or what have you, Asian Americans, are all interconnected, right? So there's a passion about trying to speak to and be a voice for marginalized communities. And so I think that kind of tendency is really important. And it's important to have those viewpoints. And I think among Gen Z progressive activists especially, there's a sense that we need to hear from people where they are, their lived experiences, and recognize that this is also part of their political story. Not so much on the political right? I think so in the political, there's still a tendency to say identity politics don't matter. We're post-racial, we're post this and that, but yet that's not really the reality. And the demographic data show, looking at young Republicans, by and large, tend to be white, I'd say.
I feel so often people on the left, and I'm very biased, but especially black folks and especially black women, tend to be more concerned about things that have happened. And I'm generalizing here. But people on the right tend to be very concerned about things that aren't happening, as a matter of fact, or that aren't going to happen. And the consequences disproportionately fall on women of color, on so many different public policies. But January 6th was a revolution about a thing that didn't happen. A stolen election didn't happen. And yet these people risked their lives, and thousands of them went to jail for that lie. Whereas black women are absolutely more likely to be hurt by these anti-abortion laws. And it's actually happening to them, which I would try to connect the dots to all of this. You have the data for it. Why they take action, because it's happening. They're living through it. And obviously their parents in history and what they learned about that, from women's suffrage to civil rights to human rights.
Okay. And I would add too, I think that's very true. But I think too that many of the young activists of color I spoke with are very cognizant of that gun violence, right? The mass shootings are terrible and horrific. And we talk about Gen Z being the lockdown generation. And the March for Our Lives movement was critical to, I think, really giving young people, young progressive activists, the tools to learn how to organize in other areas. But many of the young women leaders that I talk with who are African American say, look, I care about gun violence because this disproportionately influences my community in ways that it doesn't for white folks necessarily. I talked to one organizer who started the chapter of March for Our Lives at Howard. She said, I can't believe this isn't here at Howard University because we know that African Americans are disproportionately more likely to be victims of gun violence. And so there is, I think, a direct tie-in to that, those lived experiences in ways that you don't necessarily see on the right among young activists on the right. I think with the right, it's always the fear. It's a fear base. It's a grievance and fear, right? Like fear of what could happen. It's really these changes that they're seeing that they're uncomfortable with.
Yeah, the changes, but like, why are they not afraid of being shot in their schools? I wish they wouldn't be. It's actually not that likely, even with all the gun violence. You're far more likely to suffer violence in some other type of gun. Suicide is obviously a higher thing but specifically, why are they not more afraid of climate? You write a lot about that in the book. And why are certain people, some of us are paralyzed with anxiety part of the time thinking about climate. And it would be nice. I just saw a comedian doing this bit. Wouldn't it be nice to have to not worry about it because you don't think it's happening? So they're not worried about the things that are happening, it would seem, or are going to happen.
I think it's always what conservatives and liberals prioritize in lots of ways. I think for many conservatives today, it's more the culture, right? And so we did a big study last year on climate change, like the role of religion and examining attitudes about climate change. And really, it's more about partisan issues. Even a majority of Republicans might say, the earth is getting warmer. I can concede that. But they refuse to concede it's man-made or to come up with solutions that would require any sort of sacrifice. Instead, they're more concerned that Kamala Harris is going to take away their gas stove or not let them eat meat, which none of those things are happening, but nonetheless. But I think whereas younger people are far more aware, and because they're more educated about it, that climate change is real, that it's man-made, that there are actually changes we can make that will mitigate those, but we have to do it fairly soon, and because there might be disastrous consequences going forward. But they're very cognizant that it's infecting them, their generation, in ways that it's not going to affect older Americans, because they're going to have to live with all the consequences. And that's actually inspired them to get more involved in a lot of ways.
I think also I answered my own question when I think a lot of people are simply think that they're safer having a gun than not having a gun. They are. And of course, the data show that's not really necessary. But there isn't this kind of narrative, right? I've always said I love shooting guns. I've often wanted to have a gun in my home, but there's reasons that I don't have a gun. The main one being, God forbid, an accident. And I've had some dark times and drank some whiskey. And that's when a lot of people just kill themselves when they're drunk and making a stupid choice that they wouldn't have made the next day. It's a bad idea to have a gun in your house for a lot of reasons, which is why I don't. Statistically, what could be worse? And then just the general idea that you think you're actually going to. I always joke about this, like you think you're actually going to get your gun and protect your whole family. It's not going to happen. You're going to trip over the broom. It just doesn't. It's not how life plays out. It's not a movie. Right. And the statistics certainly show that. Melissa, final point just about conclusions in the book. It's such a good book. I knew I wouldn't scratch the surface because there's so much data. And we didn't even talk about any of the actual people that you talked to. Do you want to pick somebody or talk about anything else here at the end?
Yeah. So I'll maybe talk about Katie Etter, who I actually start the first chapter of the book about Katie's story. So she is a young woman from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and she had started a nonprofit really in 9th grade with help of her mom. But she decided that she wanted to teach younger people how to write. And so she started a nonprofit. She got her other friends who were good students going into less privileged schools in Milwaukee. And they had writing seminars. And ultimately, they were able to get these young people in middle school. Their stories were published as part of an anthology. And so this is a program that actually got spread in other countries. It was a pretty remarkable program. So she, from the beginning, was very adept at organizing and using resources and bringing people together. And then you had the shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. And she decided she wanted to get involved in the gun violence prevention movement. She organized a March for Our Lives chapter, but then she started one in Wisconsin called 50 Miles More that was really designed to be like the March in Selma, right, to mirror the civil rights marches in the South. And so she actually got all these high school students together and they marched 50 miles to Janesville, Wisconsin, which was the home of, at the time, the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, to basically say, hey, now that we've had this shooting, we know that most Americans and most young people want common sense gun reform. Will you change what you're doing? And of course, he did not change that. So shifting gears, she somehow got involved with some folks who were involved with the Women's March. And she started a whole new more nationally based organization called Future Coalition, which was a hub that brought together youth-led groups, to have resources for them, to connect them with older mentors who could walk them through the ropes of forming their own political groups. But it's just remarkable that before she was 19 years old, she had started 3 successful nonprofits. She's also someone who is queer. She identifies as she's a lesbian. She's very progressive. She cares about all of those progressive issues. And it's just a testament to, I think, her skill set, harnessing the power of social media, making her connections, but wanting to make a difference in the world. And there are lots of Katie others like that. It's really pretty remarkable.
Yeah, if they aren't your own kids, you want to read about them in this book because you found them, you interviewed them, you got to know them. And it's, for that reason alone, a fascinating book, not to mention all of the rest of the data and the way that probably only you can write about it and crunch it all. You should be everywhere on every single cable panel, podcast, and show. Melissa, this is such an enlightening book, and we all, the olds listening, need to learn all of this data so we can better understand the younger generation, so that we can better advocate for them, because it's their world a lot more than it is ours, is the point of view that I always see. I'm a bit of an ageist, though. People don't like that about me. I don't know. I just think that when it comes to policymakers, I think that young people should have as much, if not more, responsibility and power in the policies that are going to affect them, whether it becomes with any long-term issue, housing, economics, global conflict, and obviously climate. I don't know how you disagree much with that. Melissa, thank you very much for talking to me. I hope everybody gets the book, and I hope that we can be friends and talk again soon.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thanks for having me today, Pete. Appreciate it.
Well, there you go. Melissa Deckman, Politics of Gen Z, how the youngest voters will shape our democracy. Did you learn something? I certainly did. I hope you appreciated that. Let her know on Twitter, and more information about Melissa and all my guests in today and every day's show notes. See you tonight at the Hangout. John Carroll does all the music for the show. Our show, he's taking us out as he does every day right now.
Boy, you better stand up. When you're tired of begging, saying pretty please, that's the time you gotta finally get up off of your knees. When you can't see the forest for the burning trees, you got to stand up. Hey, you've been sitting so long, you got the creaky knees, you got to stand up. Stand up. I think your driving wheels been leaking grease. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Well, there's a whole lot more of us who know what's right. They'll keep right on ignoring us if we keep sitting tight. You got to open up the window to let in some light. You got to stand up. That's right. We got to rise up. You got to stand up. You got to stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear when all you hear is a lie. Don't get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence. Even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. See the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change would begin. They had to stand up. Alright, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. Alright, we got to speak up, we got to reach up, and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance Republican tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.